My son looked me dead in the eye and said, "Either you serve my wife or you leave." Just like that. No hesitation, no respect. I built that house with my own hands, paid every bill, raised that boy to be a man, and now he talks to me like a servant. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I just smiled, grabbed my old brown suitcase, and walked out into the night. But what he didn't know was that silence can cut deeper than anger, and I was done being quiet. Subscribe to hear what I did next and tell me, would you have walked away too? I still remember the sound of that old factory whistle, the one that used to scream through the air at 5 in the morning. That sound was my alarm clock for nearly 30 years. I dragged myself out of bed before sunrise, lace up my steel-toe boots, and head out into the cold. My hands have poured concrete, hauled lumber, and fixed things most men wouldn't even touch. Every blister, every scar, every aching bone was for one reason: my son Darren. I wanted him to have the kind of life I never did. So when the time came, I paid his college tuition in full. No loans, no debt, no excuses. I worked extra shifts at the plant, spent weekends doing side jobs just to keep the checks coming. I told myself it was worth it. That boy was going to walk into a future brighter than anything I'd ever known. When Darren graduated, I sat in the back row of that auditorium, wearing my best suit, the same one I wore to his mother's funeral. I clapped until my palms burned. He was the first man in our family to earn a degree, and I felt like I was watching God himself rewarding me for every sacrifice I'd ever made. The pride I felt that day was pure, clean, almost holy. People shook my hand. Afterward said, "You did good, Mr. Green." I believed I had. I believed raising him right and giving him everything I could was enough to make him good too. Years later, when he met Lisa, I helped them buy their first home. A small place on the west side of town, a white house with blue shutters, and a yard big enough for kids. I covered the down payment myself. I didn't hesitate. I wanted Darren to feel supported, to start life strong. He told me he'd pay me back one day. I smiled and said, "Son, just build a good life. That's payment enough." When he bought his first car, a used Ford Fusion, I surprised him by covering the last few $1,000s. He hugged me tight. I can still feel that moment before time and pride poisoned everything. Somewhere between those hugs and that ultimatum, something in him changed. Maybe it was the money. Maybe it was her. Lisa had ambition, but it wasn't the kind I respected. She wanted appearances. Fine clothes, fancy furniture, a lifestyle that screamed success. Darren started talking different after he married her softer voice. Bigger words, like he was trying to sound more important. He'd bring me to dinner and correct how I spoke, embarrassed when I said "ain't" or talked about my days at the plant. I laughed it off then. I thought it was just youth trying to find its place. I didn't see the warning signs. Love makes you blind. Pride keeps you that way. When his mother passed, I gave him everything: her jewelry, her photo albums, even the old gospel records she loved. He said he'd keep them safe. I believed him. Months later, I saw some of it sold online under Lisa's name. I didn't say a word. I told myself maybe they needed the money. That's what fathers do. We justify, we excuse, we forgive, until there's nothing left to forgive. I kept helping, paying their property taxes when he lost his job, covering daycare when their first child was born, buying groceries when times were tight. I never once asked for a penny back. Every dollar came from my hands, the same hands that built other men's homes and raised another man's roof under the July sun. My back hurt, my knees were shot, but I told myself it was all worth it. A man's legacy isn't his money, it's his family, or so I thought. The night he told me to leave his house, I looked around that living room and saw my entire life sitting there. The furniture I'd bought them, the walls I'd painted, the pictures I'd framed of him holding his diploma, smiling at me like I was his hero. Everything around me carried my fingerprints, yet somehow I'd become the outsider. He stood tall, arms crossed, trying to look like the man of the house, but I could still see the boy I once carried on my shoulders. And that broke me in ways I didn't think were possible. It wasn't the words that hurt, it was what they meant. All those years of giving had turned into a debt I didn't even know I owed. After I left that night, I drove with the windows down, letting the cold air sting my face. It kept me awake. I ended up at a diner off Highway 12, the kind that stays open all night and smells like burnt coffee and bacon grease. The waitress, an older woman named Shirley, poured me a cup without asking. She'd seen me before, back when I used to stop in after the night shift. "Rough night?" she asked. I nodded, staring at the steam curling from my mug. "My son," I said quietly. "He told me to get out of his house." Shirley didn't say anything for a long time. Then she just said, "Baby, sometimes the people you raise forget who taught them how to stand." That line hit me harder than any punch could. I sat there until sunrise, watching the light crawl across the parking lot, thinking about every hour I'd worked for that boy's comfort. By morning, something inside me changed. The ache was still there, but it had cooled into something sharper, something clean. I realized I'd mistaken love for weakness. I'd spent my life trying to protect him from struggle when struggle was the very thing that made me who I am. I reached into my wallet, pulled out the bank receipts I always kept folded behind my license, and laid them on the counter. Mortgage payments, utility bills, insurance, all in my name. I'd been the invisible backbone of his entire life. Not anymore. I finished my coffee, left a tip big enough to make Shirley smile, and walked out into the morning air. My hands were shaking, but not from anger, from clarity. That day I called every account I'd ever opened for Darren. The mortgage company, the credit union, the insurance office. I told them to close, cancel, or transfer every payment immediately. The woman on the other end of the line asked, "Are you sure, sir?" I said, "I've never been more sure." Each confirmation number I wrote down felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. By noon it was done. The foundation he stood on no longer belonged to him. It belonged to me again, and for the first time in years, I breathed easy. That evening I drove past their house. Lights were on, laughter spilling out through the open window. I parked across the street, invisible in the dark. I didn't feel bitterness, just distance. It's a strange kind of peace when you realize you've finally let go. I thought about knocking about, telling him one last thing, but I didn't. I turned the key and drove off, passing the church where my wife and I were married. The choir was practicing, their voices rising in harmony through the night. It reminded me of her, of everything we built together, and of the man I used to be, strong, faithful, and unbroken. Somewhere between the verses, I found my next move forming in the rhythm of their song. What I did next wasn't revenge. It was revelation. And when I tell you what came after, you'll understand that sometimes silence isn't surrender, it's strategy. When I stepped back into that house for what turned out to be the last time, it didn't feel like home anymore. The air was heavy still, and the silence didn't sound like peace. It sounded like something had died. The living room used to be my sanctuary, a place where the smell of collard greens and cornbread drifted from the kitchen while Sunday gospel played low on the radio. My wife Gloria would hum along as she polished the silver frame that held our wedding photo. Darren would dance through the hallway in his socks, laughing until he couldn't breathe. That house once held music, laughter, and the sound of a family stitched together by love and faith. Now it just held noise. The TV blared too loud, the air reeked of cheap candles and tension, and every word that came out of Lisa's mouth carried a sharpness that cut deeper than any knife. I stood in the doorway, my hand resting on the frame I'd built myself. The paint was chipped, and the wall where Gloria's favorite cross once hung now had a smudge of greasy fingerprints. I ran my thumb over it, feeling the grime, the disrespect. This was supposed to be a home built on prayer, patience, and hard work. I could still hear my wife's voice saying, "A home isn't just where you live, baby. It's where your spirit rests." But mine couldn't rest there anymore. Every corner whispered betrayal. Every piece of furniture reminded me that love doesn't always survive entitlement. Darren was sitting on the couch, his feet up on the coffee table I built the summer before he went to college. He didn't even look up when I walked in. "You forgot to close the door, Pop," he said flatly, eyes glued to the screen. I didn't answer. I just looked around, trying to recognize something, anything of the house I'd poured my life into. Lisa appeared in the hallway, holding her phone like a weapon. her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Oh, Mr. Green," she said. "I didn't expect you to come by. You should have called first." I could tell she meant, "You're not welcome here. There's a kind of pain that doesn't make you cry, it just hollows you out." That's what I felt standing in that room. The pictures on the wall were all new. No more family portraits. No photos of Gloria's garden, no framed graduation picture, no smiling faces. Just generic art that looked like it came from a clearance rack. The piano sat untouched in the corner, covered with dust. Gloria used to play hymns there on Sunday evenings while Darren pretended to sing bass. Now it looked like a tomb. I walked into the kitchen, my boots creaking against the tile I'd installed myself 15 years ago. The counters were covered in takeout boxes and dirty dishes. I remembered how Gloria would make the kitchen shine before bed, saying, "A clean kitchen brings blessings in the morning." I ran my hand over the countertop, the same one we'd picked out after saving for months. It was scratched and dull now, neglected like the love that once filled this place. Lisa opened the fridge, ignoring me, and Darren laughed at something on TV. The sound of his laughter, once my favorite music, now made my stomach twist. I stood there for a moment, my chest tight, listening to the rhythm of their voices. They spoke to each other in tones that excluded me, like I was a stranger renting space in my own house. I thought about all the Sundays I used to gather them for dinner after church, the smell of fried chicken and baked macaroni filling the air. Those meals were sacred, full of stories and prayer, the kind of nights that made a man believe his family was unbreakable. Now the dining table sat bare, collecting dust. No laughter, no grace, no family, just absence. I tried to speak, but my voice came out rough. "This place don't sound like home anymore." Darren looked at me, then finally his expression unreadable. "Times change, Pop," he said. "People change." Lisa smirked behind him, sipping her drink. "You built a house, not a museum," she added. Her words hit harder than I expected. I wanted to remind her that this house had been born from more than money. It was made from sweat, faith, and years of believing in something bigger than ourselves. But I held my tongue. My father always said, "A fool argues when silence will make him smaller." So I stayed quiet. I walked down the hallway where Darren's childhood drawings once hung. The walls were bare now. I remembered him running through that same hallway wearing his first church suit, the one Gloria had ironed for hours the night before Easter Sunday. We used to take pictures by the front door before service, Gloria adjusting his tie, while I pretended to complain about how long it took. Those moments were gone, buried under the weight of their indifference. I could almost hear Gloria whisper, "You can't build warmth into walls that hold cold hearts." I stepped into the backyard, breathing in the humid night air. The old oak tree still stood there, strong and silent, roots deep like mine. I'd built that wooden swing under it for Darren when he was 10. He used to spend hours there, his legs kicking at the sky, shouting, "Push me higher, Daddy." I used to think that swing would be here for his children someday. Now the rope was frayed, the seat cracked, the paint peeling like old skin. The garden Gloria loved had turned into a patch of weeds, the soil dry and forgotten. The house groaned behind me, the sound of its decay louder than their laughter inside. That's when it hit me. It wasn't just a house that had gone cold. It was the spirit inside it. It was me. I'd been standing still, trying to protect something that didn't exist anymore. The warmth, the unity, the faith, all of it had been replaced by noise, pride, and things that glittered without meaning. I realized that love, when unreturned, turns heavy, and I'd been carrying it alone for far too long. I walked back inside, each step heavier than the last. Darren was still on the couch, Lisa still smiling that polite, poisonous smile. I wanted to say something final, but the words wouldn't come. So I just looked around one last time, memorizing what used to be mine. The photos that weren't there, the music that no longer played, the prayers that no one said anymore. Then I reached for the light switch and turned it off. The room went dark except for the glow of the TV. Darren frowned. "What are you doing?" he asked. I paused, my hand on the doorframe. "Just remembering," I said. "This house used to shine." And then I left, closing the door behind me, the sound echoing through the hollow walls. Out in the driveway, I looked up at the windows glowing against the night sky. I thought of Gloria again, her voice soft in my memory, saying, "A home without love is just bricks and shadows." She was right. The home I built with love had become nothing more than walls. And as I drove away, I didn't feel angry anymore, just empty. But emptiness has its own kind of clarity. Because when you have nothing left to lose, you start remembering who you are. And what I remembered that night set in motion something my son would never forget. The motel room smelled like bleach and old carpet, the kind of place where people stayed when life had dropped them off at a crossroads. The neon sign outside flickered all night, painting the walls with a tired red glow that reminded me of brake lights in the rain. Room 12. 2 doors down from the ice machine, a single bed, a table, a Bible, and a chair that creaked when I breathed too hard. That's where I ended up after walking out of the house I built after hearing my son tell me to leave like I was a stranger. I didn't unpack right away. I just sat there staring at my calloused hands under the dim lamp, the same hands that had built homes, paid tuition, and buried a wife. I thought about Gloria, how she used to press my fingers against her cheek and say they were the hands of a man who provides. Now they felt like the hands of a ghost. The first night I couldn't sleep. Every sound in that room reminded me of something lost, the buzz of the ceiling fan like her voice humming a hymn, the faint hum of traffic like the radio that used to play Mahalia Jackson on Sunday mornings. I kept hearing her say, "Don't ever let the world make you bitter." Henry. Bitterness is the devil's sleep. So I lay awake, not bitter, but awake, and that was worse. Sleep is for men who have peace. I didn't have that anymore. I had plans. The next morning I walked to the church down the street, the same one Gloria and I used to attend. Pastor Lewis was sweeping the front steps, his gray suit jacket hanging off one shoulder. He looked up when he saw me. "Brother Green," he said softly, "we've been missing you." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Inside, the church was empty except for a few candles burning by the altar. I sat in the back pew, letting the silence do what words couldn't. My mind kept drifting to Darren, to Lisa, to the home that no longer felt like mine. But instead of rage, something calmer began to form. I realized I didn't want revenge out of hate. I wanted restoration balance. I didn't want to destroy him. I wanted him to understand the weight of everything he'd thrown away. After leaving the church, I stopped at the diner across the street. Shirley was working again, her hair pinned up, tight lipstick brighter than the morning sun. "You look like you didn't sleep a wink," she said, pouring me coffee before I even sat down. "Didn't have much reason to," I told her. She nodded like she understood more than she let on. "Well," she said, "sometimes God don't fix things until you stop trying to hold the hammer." I smiled faintly. "Maybe so," I said. But I wasn't ready to let go of the hammer just yet. Back at the motel, I took out a small notebook from my suitcase, the one I used to keep track of jobs and materials. I flipped through blank pages until I found one clean enough to start fresh. At the top, I wrote, "Restoration." Underneath it, I listed every financial tie I still held to Darren, every mortgage payment, every utility bill, every insurance premium. Then I added notes about the construction business, the properties still under my name, the account where Gloria's life insurance payout had been sitting untouched for years. I hadn't realized how much power I still held. Quiet power, the kind that doesn't shout, just waits. That night I sat outside on the motel balcony watching cars slide past under the streetlights. A couple argued in the parking lot, their voices sharp and raw. I could have been them once, back when Gloria and I were young and fire burned hotter than wisdom. But time teaches you something fire never can, that silence is sharper than noise. I thought about calling Darren, about demanding an apology, but the thought passed as quickly as it came. He wasn't ready to hear me, and I wasn't ready to waste another word. Instead, I prayed. Not for him, not yet, but for clarity. On the third day, I visited the credit union. Miss Jenkins, who'd known me for 20 years, looked surprised to see me in work clothes again. "Mr. Green," she said, "what brings you in?" I leaned on the counter and told her I needed to make some adjustments to my accounts. Temporary changes, I said. She gave me that curious look women give when they know there's more to the story but decide to keep it to themselves. All right, she said. Let's take care of you. An hour later, Darren's financial lifeline was officially severed. The house, the cars, the comfort, they were all about to feel the cold hand of consequence. And I didn't need to lift a single threat or raise my voice. Back at the motel, I made another list. This one wasn't about money. It was about memory. I wrote down every lesson I'd ever tried to teach that boy. Respect, humility, gratitude, patience. I realized he hadn't forgotten them. He'd just never had to live them. And I was about to give him that chance. But to do it right, I needed patience too. A storm doesn't need to announce itself. It just needs to build pressure until the sky gives way. That evening, Pastor Lewis knocked on my door. I hadn't told him where I was staying, but somehow he knew. God told me to check on you, he said, smiling like he was in on a secret. I laughed, the first real laugh I'd had in weeks. I'm all right, Pastor, I said, just taking a little time to think. He nodded, his eyes narrowing like he saw straight through me. Thinking's good, he said. But don't mistake planning for healing. You still got to let God handle what's His. I looked at him for a long moment before saying, I'm just handling what's mine. He studied me, then nodded slowly. Then handle it with grace. When he left the room, felt smaller, heavier with his words. Grace. I wasn't sure I had any left. That night I dreamed of Gloria. She was standing in our old kitchen stirring a pot of gumbo, humming that same hymn she always did when she was deep in thought. When she turned around, she said, Don't fight him, Henry. Teach him. I woke up before I could answer. The dawn light crept through the blinds, painting the floor in stripes of gold. Maybe that was my answer. Maybe teaching didn't have to come from kindness. It could come from consequence. I spent the next few days visiting places that once defined me: the hardware store, the park where I used to coach Little League, the construction site where I taught Darren how to drive a nail straight. Everywhere I went, people asked about him. How's your boy, they'd say. I'd smile politely and change the subject. But word travels fast in small towns. I knew sooner or later people would find out the truth. And when they did, I didn't want pity. I wanted silence, the kind that lets guilt echo. By the end of that week, the motel clerk knew my name, the waitress knew my coffee order, and my plan was nearly complete. I wasn't out for destruction. I wanted him to feel what I'd felt: the sting of loss, the weight of humility, the hollow echo of an empty house. But more than anything, I wanted him to remember the man who built his world so he could understand what it means when that man decides to walk away. On Sunday morning, I put on my old suit, the one Gloria bought me for our 25th anniversary, and went back to church. The choir was singing "His Eye is on the Sparrow." I took a seat in the last pew, letting the music wash over me. There was peace in that sound, a reminder that faith isn't about pretending not to hurt. It's about trusting that the hurt has a purpose. And as I sat there, I knew exactly what had to come next. The next chapter wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about legacy. And when I made my move, it wouldn't be with anger in my hands, it would be with truth. And truth has a way of burning longer than fire. The phone felt heavier than it should have, like it knew what I was about to do. I sat at that rickety motel desk with the blinds half open, morning light slicing across the Bible, and the half-empty cup of coffee beside me. My hands didn't shake. Not this time. I'd spent my life building, fixing, paying, holding things together for other people. That morning I was going to learn what it felt like to let it all fall. The first number I dialed was the bank. A woman answered, cheerful and unsuspecting. "Thank you for calling Franklin First. How can I help you today?" Her voice was smooth, like someone reading from a script, but I could tell she'd never heard a voice like mine before. Calm, steady, carrying decades of quiet storms. "My name is Henry Green," I said. "I'd like to cancel the automatic payments on account number 2468. I read it out slowly, clear enough that she wouldn't have to ask twice. She started to speak, her tone shifting professional now. Sir, those payments are linked to a joint account for the mortgage. Are you sure you want to? Yes, I said, cutting her off. Effective immediately. There was a pause, the sound of keys clacking in the background, and then she said the words I'd been waiting to hear. All right, Mr. Green. You're all set. You'll receive a confirmation number via email. I wrote the number down in my notebook, the same one I used to plan my construction projects. Each digit looked like a nail hammered into a coffin I'd built with my own hands. But it wasn't mine this time, it was his. I thanked her, ended the call, and dialed the next one. Insurance. The man on the other end tried to sound casual, but his voice wavered when I told him to cancel the policy tied to the house. Sir, may I ask why you're doing this, he said. I smiled to myself. Because I've been paying for something that doesn't belong to me. Another confirmation number. Another cut string. By the time I called the credit card company, my pulse had settled into a slow rhythm. The woman there sounded young, maybe around my son's age, full of that polished politeness they teach in customer service training. Mr. Green, we do offer flexible solutions to help families. Families. I repeated, my voice low. You ever had a family take from you? Miss not money respect. She didn't know what to say after that. She just gave me the number. I wrote it down, closed the notebook, and leaned back in the chair. The motel air conditioner rattled behind me, blowing out more dust than cold. Outside, the neon sign blinked vacancy in red. I thought about how many people had probably sat right here, lost and broke, trying to piece their lives back together. The difference was, I wasn't broken. I'd been tested, humiliated, stripped of everything I thought I was, but I was still standing. That's the thing about men like me, we don't shatter, we settle. Like concrete. Hard, unmoving, permanent. My phone buzzed with a new message. It was from Darren. Hey, Pop, can we talk later? Need to figure out what's going on with the mortgage payment. No apology, no humility, just the same entitled tone. I didn't respond. Instead, I set the phone face down and poured myself another cup of coffee. I'd spent years bailing him out, believing that if I just gave enough, he'd grow into the man I hoped he'd be. But some men only grow when the soil's stripped bare. I drove to the post office next. The clerk recognized me. Small town, word travels fast. Mr. Green, haven't seen you in a while, she said, smiling. What brings you by? Just tying up loose ends, I said, sliding a few envelopes across the counter. Letters to the utility companies, the HOA, even the life insurance policy that listed Darren as the beneficiary. I changed everything. Every account, every connection, every trace of my name attached to his comfort. By noon, the web was gone. The boy who thought he'd cut me loose had no idea I'd been the one holding the strings all along. When I got back to the motel, the sunlight had shifted, casting long shadows across the parking lot. I pulled out the notebook again and flipped through the pages. My handwriting, once rough and uneven from years of hard labor, looked steadier now. Each confirmation number stood in a row, clean and final. I thought about the old sayings my father used to tell me when I was young. Keep your name clean, boy. Keep your money straight. Don't ever let a fool manage your blessings. I hadn't listened back then, but I understood now. Money was never just about survival. It was about control, about freedom. And for the first time in a long time, I had both. The phone rang again. Darren. I let it ring out. Then came the text. Dad, the bank said you canceled the payments. What are you doing? We can't cover this. The message lit up the screen, a glowing little piece of panic. I could almost hear his voice in my head, the same one that once asked for help buying a suit for prom or gas money for college. Back then it made me proud to provide. Now it just made me tired. I typed back one sentence. Figure it out, son. Then I turned off the phone. That evening I drove out toward the edge of town where the old mill used to stand before it burned down. The lot was empty now. overgrown with weeds, but the smell of iron and smoke still lingered if you stood there long enough. I used to bring Darren here when he was a boy, tell him stories about how men earned their place in the world by sweating for it. He'd listen wide-eyed while I told him that hard work was the only inheritance worth having. I thought about that now, how those words must have gone in one ear and out the other. The world had softened him. Maybe I had too. As I stood there, a car slowed behind me. It was Pastor Lewis. He rolled down the window and said, "Henry, you all right out here?" I nodded, just thinking. He smiled the kind of knowing smile that only preachers have. "Thinking's good," he said, "but you can't live in it too long. God's already 3 steps ahead of your plans." I watched his taillights fade down the road, the sound of his engine fading into the distance. Maybe he was right. Maybe this wasn't punishment. It was correction. Back at the motel, I opened the Bible on the table. The page fell open to Proverbs. A wise man leaves an inheritance for his children's children. I read the verse twice, then closed the book. Maybe what I was leaving Darren wasn't money or property. Maybe it was something harder to swallow, the lesson that a man's word once broken costs more than any mortgage. I lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling fan spinning slow above me. The air was thick, but for the first time in months I felt light. Free. Every confirmation number in that notebook wasn't an ending, it was a beginning. The sound of justice doesn't always come from gavel or gunfire. Sometimes it comes from a quiet click on the other end of a phone line. And as I drifted off to sleep, I realized something else. The silence that followed wasn't empty anymore. It was clean. But what came next? That was when the real reckoning began. The first whisper came from the barber shop. It always does. News in our town doesn't start with the papers. It starts with the hum of clippers, the smell of shaving cream, and the low murmur of men who've seen too much to be surprised, but still get angry when respect gets lost. I was sitting in the corner chair of Jackson's Cuts that Saturday morning, pretending to read the sports section while they talked. I hadn't said a word about what happened between me and Darren, but truth has a way of finding its way through cracks like light slipping under a closed door. Jackson, the owner, was lining up a customer when he said, "Y'all hear about Henry Green's boy?" The room got quiet, the way only a black barbershop can, sudden and sharp. The kind of silence that means something big is about to drop. "What about him?" someone asked, voice low. Jackson flicked his wrist-brushed hair from his client's neck and said, "He had his daddy paying his mortgage man, then turned around and told him to get out." Can you believe that? The room erupted. "Nah, not Henry. You lying. That boy lost his damn mind." It was like a choir of disbelief. Men who'd worked with me, laughed with me, broke bread with me. They all had the same expression now, disgust and pity. But it wasn't pity for me. It was pity for Darren. Because in a community like ours, there's no deeper shame than forgetting who raised you. Respect isn't just expected, it's sacred. I kept my eyes on the paper, pretending not to listen, but every word felt like balm on a wound that had been raw for too long. I didn't need to defend myself. They were doing it for me. One of the younger barbers shook his head and said, "That's crazy, man. Mr. Green's a solid dude. He helped my uncle get that roofing job last year." Jackson nodded. "That's right. And now his own son treating him like some old fool. Don't sit right with me." I folded my paper, stood up slow, and dropped a 20 on the counter. "You gentlemen take care," I said. Jackson looked up, met my eyes, and I saw the understanding there. "You all right, OG?" he asked quietly. I nodded. "Always," I said, walking out into the sunlight. The whispers followed me like a current, but they didn't sting, they steadied me. By Sunday morning, it had spread further. The church parking lot was full when I pulled up. The choir's voices floated through the open doors, gospel harmonies rising into the warm air. I hadn't planned on going that day, but something told me I needed to be there. The minute I stepped inside, people turned. Some smiled gently, others nodded. A few avoided my eyes, not out of shame but out of respect. They knew enough not to pry. After service, I stood outside near the steps where Gloria and I used to stand after Sunday dinners, greeting folks like it was our duty to love the neighborhood back. Pastor Lewis came down wiping sweat from his brow. "Brother Green," he said, "good to see you in the house again." I smiled. "Needed to hear the word today, Pastor." He nodded slowly, eyes kind but sharp. "Word's been moving through town faster than my sermon," he said. "You holding up?" "I'm standing," I said simply. He studied me, then patted my shoulder. "You keep standing, brother. God's watching, and so is this community." A group of older women from the congregation passed by, whispering to each other, but not the way people gossip. It was more like prayer wrapped in conversation. "You know Henry's boy," one said softly. "Raised in church all them years and now this." Another shook her head. "The devil works hardest in the hearts we love most." They saw me standing there, and one of them stepped forward, took my hand. "You just keep walking in grace, baby," she said. "God don't let truth stay buried." I thanked her, but inside I felt something shift, something heavier than pride, lighter than anger. Vindication. Not the loud kind that comes from proving someone wrong, but the quiet kind that comes when your truth finally breathes on its own. In our world, reputation is currency, and mine, after everything, was still intact. Later that afternoon, I stopped by the corner store to grab a few things. The owner, Mr. Jenkins, gave me that same knowing look. "Heard some talk," he said, ringing up my items. "Don't know if it's all true, but I do know one thing: you always been a man who paid his dues." I nodded, sliding a 20 across the counter. "Appreciate that," I said. He leaned in, voice low. "Word gets around, Henry. Folks see how you handled yourself. You didn't raise your voice, didn't throw dirt. That's rare these days. You did it right." Outside, kids were riding bikes down the street, laughter echoing off the houses. I stood there a minute watching them, thinking about how small towns remember everything. People forget birthdays, anniversaries, even funerals. But they never forget when a man stands tall after being torn down. It becomes part of the legend. That evening, I went back to church for the evening choir practice. The sanctuary was mostly empty except for a few deacons and the sound of Sister Louise at the piano. She looked up when she saw me and smiled. "You planning on joining the choir now, Mr. Green?" she joked. "Not yet," I said, grinning. "Just listening." The music filled the room, and I closed my eyes, letting it wash over me. Each note reminded me that truth once set free doesn't need defending. It speaks in whispers at barbershops and murmurs outside the church, in looks exchanged between neighbors who know what right and wrong look like. The community had become my witness, my courtroom, my jury, and their verdict was already written. As the last chord faded, I looked up at the stained glass window above the altar. The light through it turned everything gold, like the whole room was glowing with something bigger than any one man's pain. I thought about Darren then, not with anger, but with something close to pity. Because now, every time he'd walk through town, people wouldn't see a man, they'd see the boy who forgot his father. And no amount of money or pride could cover that. When I left the church, the night air was warm and soft crickets chirping like background music. My phone buzzed again, another text from him. I didn't open it. Some things don't need answering. I slipped the phone into my pocket and started walking toward the edge of town, where the streetlights dimmed, and the world got quiet. The truth had finally found its voice, and it was louder than gossip, stronger than shame. I didn't need to shout my story anymore. The community was already telling it for me. And somewhere deep inside I knew this was only the beginning, because the next time my name crossed their lips, it wouldn't be about loss. It would be about the kind of man who doesn't just survive the storm. He learns how to walk in the rain. Sunday morning came heavy with heat, the kind that settles into your bones and won't let go. I woke early, shaved, put on the gray suit Gloria bought me the year before she passed. It still fit, though time had softened me in places. I shined my shoes until I could see my reflection, straightened my tie, and stood in front of the mirror a long time. The man looking back wasn't broken. He wasn't bitter. He was ready. I'd heard through the grapevine that Darren and Lisa had started talking loudly publicly, desperately trying to rewrite what everyone already knew. They'd been telling folks that I was confused, that I was losing my memory, that old age had made me forget what I'd done for them. It might have worked on strangers, but in a town that raised me a lie has a short life. Still, they were coming to church that morning, and I knew why. They wanted to reclaim their image, smooth over the damage with polished smiles and false humility. But the truth has its own rhythm, and that morning it was about to speak. When I pulled into the church parking lot, the air was thick with murmurs. People nodded at me, some gave quiet smiles, others whispered to each other. The choir was already inside, voices rising and falling like waves. I could see Darren's car parked near the front. Lisa stood outside the doors in a pastel dress, sunglasses covering her eyes, pretending to greet people. She froze when she saw me step out of my truck. For a second I saw panic flicker across her face, quick as lightning. Then she straightened her shoulders, turned to the woman beside her, and kept smiling like nothing happened. I walked slow, deliberate. Each step up the walkway felt heavier than the last, but it wasn't weakness. It was purpose. Darren appeared at the top of the church steps, hands in his pockets, jaw tight. He looked older somehow, though not wiser. "Dad," he said, forcing a smile, "we were just talking about you." His voice carried too far, trying too hard. I could feel the crowd's attention shifting. The gossip that had filled the town all week was gathering right here in front of the Lord's house. Lisa stepped forward before I could speak. "We've been worried about you, Mr. Green," she said, her tone dripping with sweetness that didn't match her eyes. "You've been saying things that aren't true. The stress, it's been too much. Maybe you should take a break, see someone." She reached out like she was offering pity. I looked at her hand, then at her face, and smiled the way a man does when he's past anger. "Is that what you told folks?" I asked quietly. "That I've lost my mind?" Darren shifted, glancing around at the people who'd stopped pretending not to listen. "Dad, come on," he said, his voice softening. "Let's not do this here." I took one more step up so we were almost eye to eye. "Son," I said, calm and steady, "you can say a lot about me. You can call me old, stubborn, hard-headed. But don't you ever say I've lost my mind. I may be old, but I still know the difference between right and wrong." The air around us changed. The crowd went silent. Even the choir inside seemed to pause mid-hymn. Darren's mouth opened, but no words came. Lisa looked away, her smile cracking under the weight of it. For a long moment, no one moved. It was just me, my son, and the truth hanging between us. Then I stepped back, turned toward the congregation gathered near the steps, and said, "This church raised me. These people saw me work, give, build, and forgive. I've never been perfect, but I've been honest. And I won't let lies live in a place built for truth." A murmur rippled through the crowd, low, respectful, electric. Pastor Lewis had come to the doorway, watching quietly. His face was unreadable, but his eyes told me he understood. This wasn't just a father confronting a son. This was a reckoning, and the church was the witness. Darren tried to recover his voice, trembling. "You're making a scene, Pop. You're turning people against us." I looked at him the way my own father once looked at me when I disappointed him. Steady, heavy, but not cruel. "You don't need my help for that," I said. "You did it yourself." Lisa started to say something, but I raised my hand. "Enough. I've spent my life keeping peace where there wasn't any fixing things that other people broke. But this," I gestured between us, "this I can't fix for you. You'll have to live with it." Someone from the crowd called out softly, "Tell the truth, Brother Green." That one voice turned into others, a quiet wave of support rolling through the people who'd gathered. I didn't need applause. I didn't need pity. What I felt was something cleaner: vindication without vengeance. Darren's face flushed red. He glanced at Lisa, then at the pastor, then back at me. "You're embarrassing yourself," he said through clenched teeth. I smiled again, The kind of smile that comes from knowing the battle's already over. Maybe I said. But I'd rather stand embarrassed in truth than comfortable in a lie. With that, I turned and started up the church steps. Each step felt lighter. When I reached the door, Pastor Lewis moved aside and said quietly, "You go on, Henry. God's house is still your home." Inside, the air was cool, filled with the lingering scent of incense and wood polish. I sat in the same pew where Gloria and I used to sit, right under the stained glass window with the crown of thorns. The service began again, the choir picking up the hymn they'd paused. "His truth is marching on," they sang. The words wrapped around me like armor. Outside, I could hear murmurs spreading again, but this time they carried a different weight. The story had shifted. It wasn't about a confused old man anymore. It was about a father who stood his ground, a man who refused to be erased from his own legacy. When service ended, I walked back down those steps. Darren and Lisa were gone, but people stopped to shake my hand. Some said, "We love you, Brother Green." Others just nodded, eyes shining with quiet respect. By the time I reached my truck, the heat had broken. Clouds gathered overhead and a soft wind moved through the trees. I sat for a moment, letting the hum of the engine mix with the sound of distant thunder. That confrontation hadn't been about pride. It was about truth finding its voice. As I pulled onto the road, I saw a few of the younger men from church watching me drive off, whispering to each other. I knew what they were saying. They were talking about the look in my eyes, about how a man can age without getting small. They were seeing the kind of strength that doesn't fade. It just gets quieter, sharper, more deliberate. The storm broke behind me as I drove away, rain streaking across the windshield. I didn't turn on the wipers right away. I liked the way the water blurred the world outside, softening the edges of everything. Because deep down I knew this wasn't the end of the story. The truth had only just begun to work. And when it finished, every lie that boy ever told would crumble under its weight. It was a few weeks after that Sunday at the church when the truth finally clawed its way into daylight. I'd started to feel the shift long before anyone said a word. The whispers that once carried pity had turned sharp with curiosity, then outrage. People started stopping me at the grocery store, at the gas station, asking careful questions like, "You doing all right, Mr. Green?" I'd nod, smile, keep walking. I knew something was moving beneath the surface, and it was only a matter of time before the earth cracked open. It started with a phone call. Not the kind that brings bad news, but the kind that starts with silence, heavy enough to make your pulse pick up. "Mr. Green," the voice said, "this is Attorney Watkins from Franklin County Records. I think you might want to come down here." When I got there, Watkins looked tired, like he'd been sitting on a secret too long. He slid a folder across the table, the manila edges soft from handling. "We were reviewing property documents for tax updates," he said. Something didn't look right. He opened it, and there it was, my signature. Or what was supposed to be my signature. My name written in a shaky imitation of my hand on a deed transferring ownership of my home to Darren and Lisa. Dated months before the night he told me to leave. For a moment, everything in me went still. I didn't blink, didn't breathe. The world around me dimmed until all I could see was that forged line, my name stolen from me by the same hands I once taught to write. Watkins kept talking, explaining about legal implications, potential fraud charges, police involvement. I barely heard him. I was too busy thinking about the nights I'd stayed late at the kitchen table helping Darren with his homework, correcting the loops in his cursive, showing him how to spell his name right. And now that same hand had been used to erase me. "Can you prove this isn't your signature?" Watkins asked. I looked up steady. "Son," I said, "I built that house nail by nail. My fingerprints are on every inch of it. You tell me what kind of man signs away his life without a fight." He nodded slowly. "That's what I thought." 2 days later, the sheriff showed up at Darren's house with papers in hand. I wasn't there, but the neighbors were. They told me later that Lisa tried to talk her way out of it. Tears in her eyes, voice trembling. Darren stood behind her, pale and silent. The sheriff handed them the warrant and said, Looks like this house don't belong to you after all." When the news hit town, it spread faster than wildfire in July. Folks at the church were talking, the barbershop was buzzing again, and even people I hadn't spoken to in years called, just to say, "We knew something didn't add up." That's the thing about lies. They burn bright for a while, but truth smolders. It waits. It breathes. And when it rises, it burns cleaner than fire. The following week I stood before the judge, documents laid out on the bench like relics of betrayal. Darren was there too, shoulders slumped, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. Lisa kept her head down, hands folded in her lap, the picture of shame. The judge, a tall black woman with eyes sharp as glass, read through every page, her voice steady. "Forgery," she said finally. "Intent to defraud. Illegal transfer of ownership." Each word hit like a gavel before the actual one fell. She turned her eyes to me. "Mr. Green, I want to thank you for your patience." Most men would have lost their temper long before this. I nodded, not trusting my voice. Then she looked at Darren. "You should know something," she said. "A father's forgiveness is a blessing, but it's not protection from consequence. You took from the man who gave you everything. You tried to steal not just his house, but his dignity. That's something no court can restore, but God can remind you what it feels like to live without it." Her gavel came down once. Just once. The house, the land, every title reverted to my name. Walking out of that courthouse felt like stepping into sunlight after years underground. The world looked sharper, cleaner. The air tasted different. I drove back to the old neighborhood slow, letting every turn sink in. When I pulled up in front of the house that once held laughter, betrayal, silence, and now justice, I sat there a long while before getting out. The yard was overgrown, the paint peeling, but it was mine again. I walked up the steps, ran my hand along the banister, the same one I'd sanded smooth decades ago. The front door creaked when I opened it, dust motes dancing in the light. It didn't feel haunted anymore. It felt waiting. I took a deep breath and said softly, "I'm home, Gloria." Over the next few days, the town kept talking. Some folks said Darren should have gone to jail. Others said I should have disowned him completely. But I didn't do either. I let the law handle justice. God would handle the rest. Pastor Lewis stopped by one evening, standing on the porch with that calm smile of his. "You see," he said, "told you God don't sleep." I nodded, looking out toward the setting sun. "No, he doesn't," I said. "He just takes his time waking folks up." That night I walked through the house with a hammer in my hand, not out of anger, out of purpose. I fixed the broken hinge on the back door, patched the crack in the wall, swept the floors clean. Every nail I drove in was an act of restoration. Every swing of that hammer echoed like prayer. I found one of Gloria's old records tucked away in a box, the one she used to play on quiet evenings. I set it on the turntable, wiped the dust, and let it spin. The room filled with her voice again, warm and steady, the sound of home returning. I stood there, eyes closed, and felt something settle deep inside me. Not triumph, not revenge, just peace. The next morning I got up early and walked down to the barber shop. Jackson looked up when I came in, grinning. Well, look who's back where he belongs," he said. "Heard the law put things right." I sat in the same chair as before, nodding. "Truth did," I said. "The law just caught up." He laughed, shaking his head. "Man, you handled that with more grace than I would have." I smiled, looking at my reflection in the mirror. Grace is for the living. I just wanted my peace back. He snapped the cape around my shoulders, clippers buzzing. "You got that now, Henry." Outside, the morning sun lit the storefront windows, and the sound of the clippers faded into something softer, something steady. Justice had come full circle, not loud, not vengeful, just right. As I walked out later, people waved, tipped their hats, called out my name. Respect had returned not because I demanded it, but because I'd earned it the only way that matters, by standing firm when the world tried to bend me. And as I looked down the street toward the church, I could almost hear Pastor Lewis's voice again echoing in my head. God don't sleep, he'd said, and I believed it. Because some truths don't need to be shouted from the mountaintop, they just need time to rise. And mine finally had. The church was full that Sunday, so full the ushers had to bring out folding chairs from the back. Word had spread through town like wildfire that something was going to happen. People came early, dressed sharp, fanning themselves with programs printed with scripture and the pastor's picture. The choir was already humming low, a slow, soulful rhythm that sounded like the air itself was praying. I sat near the front in the same pew where Gloria used to sit, her Bible always open, even when she already knew the words by heart. I hadn't planned to come, not until Pastor Lewis called me the night before and said, "You need to be here tomorrow, Henry. God's about to finish what he started." I didn't ask what he meant. I just came. When I walked in, heads turned. Some nodded respectfully, some smiled, a few whispered. I didn't blame them. The story between me and my son had lived in this town long enough to grow its own wings. But I wasn't there for gossip. I was there for whatever was coming. The air inside was thick with that mix of perfume, cologne, and old wooden pews. It smelled like home and history. The service began like any other. Hymns, scripture, a few amens scattered through the crowd. But the whole time I could feel something building like a storm that hadn't decided whether to break or pass. When Pastor Lewis finally stood up for testimony, his voice carried the weight of it. "The Lord works in ways that test us," he said. "Sometimes he breaks us down so he can build us back up stronger than we were before. And sometimes he brings people back to the same place they fell so they can stand right this time." He turned toward me, then toward the back of the church. "Brother Darren," he said, his voice soft but sure, "you have something you want to say?" The whole room shifted. Every head turned as my son stood from the last pew. He looked different. The arrogance was gone. His shoulders were heavy, his face drawn, eyes red like he hadn't slept in days. Lisa wasn't with him. He walked slow, steady down the center aisle. The choir stopped humming. Even the children in the back went silent. All you could hear was the sound of his shoes against the floor. When he reached the front, he didn't look at me right away. He stood before the congregation, gripping the pulpit like it was the only thing keeping him upright. His voice trembled when he spoke. "I don't deserve to stand here," he said, "but I need to." He paused, swallowing hard. "My father gave me everything. His time, his money, his trust. He taught me what a man should be, and I took all that and threw it back in his face." His voice cracked, raw and unguarded. "I lied. I stole. I dishonored the man who raised me. I repaid love with shame." A low murmur rippled through the crowd, the sound of hearts breaking and healing all at once. Darren took a shaky breath and kept going. "When I forged those papers, I told myself I was just fixing my life. But really I was trying to erase the part of it that reminded me of how small I felt next to him. I didn't just take his house. I tried to take his place." He looked out over the congregation, then voice steadying. "But God don't sleep. He brought the truth to light, and he made me see what I'd become. And now I stand here not to ask for pity, but to ask for forgiveness from my Father, from all of you, and from God himself." The silence that followed was heavy, sacred. Pastor Lewis put a hand on Darren's shoulder. "Son," he said, "forgiveness don't erase what happened, but it opens the door for what's next. You've taken the first step. Now let the Lord walk you the rest of the way." Then he turned to me. "Brother Henry," he said, "you have something to say." For a moment I couldn't move. My throat tightened. My hands clenched on the pew in front of me. Every part of me wanted to stay seated to let silence do the talking. But Gloria's voice whispered in my head the way she used to when she knew I was about to harden up. "Don't let pride do the devil's work for you, baby. Let grace have a turn." I stood slow but steady. The congregation turned as I walked toward the front. Darren looked down when I reached him, his shoulders shaking. I could see the boy he used to be hiding beneath the man he'd become. I stood beside him, the weight between us thick as the air before rain. "Look at me," I said quietly. He did. His eyes were full of guilt, but beneath it I saw something else, remorse raw and real. "You broke me, son," I said. "You cut me deep. But I've lived long enough to know one thing: hate only grows what it's fed, and I'm done feeding it." He started to speak, but I held up my hand. "You don't need to say anything else. You already said what mattered. The rest is between you and God." Then I did something I hadn't planned, something I hadn't thought I was capable of. I reached out and pulled him into an embrace. For a moment he didn't move. Then his body collapsed against mine, shaking with sobs that came from somewhere deep. The kind that cleans a man's soul. The church filled with the sound of it, soft crying, quiet amens, a few shouts of "Thank you, Jesus." I felt the years of anger and disappointment slip off me like a heavy coat. All the bitterness, all the pride gone. What was left was something lighter. Forgiveness doesn't erase pain, it just makes it livable. When we finally stepped back, Pastor Lewis raised his hands and said, "This is what redemption looks like. This is what grace sounds like." The choir began to sing slow and tender, the organ rolling underneath like thunder wrapped in mercy. Darren wiped his eyes and whispered, "I don't deserve you." I smiled, voice low. "Neither of us deserve what God gives, son. But we take it anyway." He nodded, tears streaming down his face. The congregation stood, people clapping, some crying, some singing. It wasn't noisy, it was holy. The kind of sound that comes from people who know what it means to fall and be lifted again. After service, folks came up to us one by one. Some hugged me, others patted Darren on the back. One old man, Mr. Jenkins, shook his head and said, "Took me 30 years to forgive my own daddy. You did it in one morning. That's God right there." As we walked out into the sunlight, Darren turned to me. "I want to make things right," he said. "Not just say it, do it." I looked at him, saw the sincerity in his eyes, and said, "Then start with what's broken, not what's easy." He nodded. We stood there for a moment on those same church steps where it all fell apart weeks earlier. Now it felt different. Lighter. Like something had been set free between us. Something bigger than either of our mistakes. When I drove home, the sky was wide and clear, the air warm. I turned on the radio and the same hymn from that morning came on. Amazing Grace. I rolled down the window, let the wind carry it, and smiled. Forgiveness isn't forgetting. It's remembering without bitterness. And as I pulled into my driveway, the house shining in the late afternoon sun, I knew this chapter wasn't about revenge or victory anymore. It was about peace. But what came next, that was something even deeper. A month after that Sunday service, the town finally went quiet again. The gossip faded. The whispers softened, and the story that had once followed me everywhere became just another part of the local legend told in barbershops, repeated after Sunday dinners, passed around like a lesson everyone already knew. I didn't chase peace. It just started showing up on its own, like a guest who knocked softly instead of kicking down the door. Darren and I spoke now and then. He was rebuilding, working at the mechanics shop on Broad Street, trying to find his way back into the man he'd once wanted to be. I didn't make it easy, but I didn't make it impossible either. Forgiveness doesn't erase what's done, it just stops you from bleeding on it. One morning I woke before sunrise and walked out to the porch. The air was thick with that early southern humidity that smells like wet earth and magnolia. I looked out at the house, my house sitting quiet in the dawn. It had stood for more than 40 years through storms, laughter, and loss. I'd built every inch of it, sweated over every nail. But as I stood there, coffee steaming in my hand, I knew it didn't belong to me anymore, not really. It had been a home once, then a battleground, and now it was just a building waiting for its next purpose. That's when I made my decision. Not out of anger, not out of pity, out of clarity. I called the Veterans Housing Outreach office in town, the same folks who'd helped me years ago when one of my old Army buddies lost his home after his wife passed. I remembered how they'd found him a small apartment, helped him get back on his feet, treated him with dignity when the world had forgotten his name. I asked to speak with the director, a woman named Lorraine. "Mr. Green," she said when she answered, "how can we help you today?" I took a long breath, watching the sun creep up over the horizon. "I want to donate a house," I said. "Not just any house, the one I built, the one that's seen everything." There was silence on the line, then a soft, "Sir, are you sure?" I smiled. "I'm sure. A home should belong to those who still understand sacrifice. Folks who know what it means to give and expect nothing back." Lorraine didn't say much after that. She just thanked me, her voice trembling a little, and said they'd handle the paperwork right away. When I hung up, I felt something lift off my chest. For the first time in years, the house wasn't a reminder of what I'd lost. It was a gift I was giving away freely. Over the next week, the outreach team came by to take photos and prepare the deed transfer. Darren stopped by when he heard. "You're giving it away?" he asked, disbelief written all over his face. Just like that, I nodded. "It's not mine anymore, son. It's meant for someone who still knows what it costs to stand tall." He looked down quiet for a long time. "You could have sold it," he said finally. "Made money, retired somewhere nicer." I smiled. "Money builds houses. It don't build peace." He didn't argue after that, just nodded, eyes wet, and said, "You're something else, Pop." I laughed softly. "Took you long enough to notice." The donation ceremony was small but beautiful. The church choir sang a hymn, Pastor Lewis gave a short prayer, and a few veterans from the community stood by with their families. Some were young, still carrying the edge of deployment in their eyes. Others were older, worn, but steady. One of them, a man named Samuel, came up to me afterward and said, "You have no idea what this means to us." I shook his hand, feeling the strength in his grip. "Oh, I do," I said. "I've been where you are. And I've learned one thing. No man owns a home forever. We just take care of it until someone else needs it more." After that, I packed a few boxes, just the essentials, my Bible, Gloria's old record player, a stack of her favorite albums, and a framed photo of us taken the summer we finished building the house. I didn't need much else. I moved to a small cabin by Lake Monroe, about 40 miles out of town. It wasn't fancy, just 2 rooms and a porch overlooking the water, but it felt right. The first morning there, I brewed a pot of coffee, sat on the porch, and watched the sunlight break over the lake. The water rippled like glass, catching the light in slow golden waves. I opened my Bible and read a verse from Psalms. "He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me beside the still waters." I laughed under my breath. "You sure did, Lord. Took you long enough, but you sure did." Days fell into rhythm. Mornings with coffee and scripture, afternoons fishing off the dock, evenings listening to the crickets, while Gloria's records spun on the turntable. Sometimes I'd drive into town to check on the veterans' home. I'd see kids playing in the yard, families grilling on Sundays, laughter spilling out from the porch. Each time I'd smile and keep driving. That house was alive again, and that was enough. Darren visited one weekend. He brought groceries, tools, and a folding chair he swore was the most comfortable thing in the world. "Thought you might want company," he said, setting it down beside mine on the porch. We sat in silence for a while, the lake calm and silver under the setting sun. "You happy here, Pop?" he asked finally. I nodded. Happy's not the word. Content, maybe. Peaceful. He looked out at the water. "You ever think about coming back to town?" I shook my head. I left what needed leaving. Besides, peace don't live in places. It lives in people. He smiled at that, quiet but proud. "I'm trying to find mine," he said. I looked at him, then really looked. The guilt was gone, replaced by something steadier. He was finally standing on his own the way I'd always hoped he would. "You will," I said. "Just don't look for it in things. Look for it in what you give." As the sun sank low, we sat there watching the sky turn gold, then orange, then deep blue. The world felt still. Later that night after he left, I sat alone on the porch with the lamp burning low beside me. The crickets were loud, the lake still and dark. I thought about everything that had happened, the betrayal, the loss, the forgiveness, the redemption. It all led here to this quiet moment where nothing hurt anymore. I'd lost a house, but found my soul. I took one last sip of coffee, the mug warm in my hands, and whispered to the night, "We did all right, Gloria." The wind rustled the trees soft and steady like her answer. Then I leaned back, closed my eyes, and smiled. Because peace doesn't roar. It hums low and sure like the sound of water against wood. And somewhere beyond that still lake, I knew my story wasn't ending. It was simply settling into forever. As we grow older, life has a way of teaching us that peace doesn't always come from holding on. It often comes from knowing when to let go. The story reminds us that forgiveness is not weakness but wisdom. It frees the soul and restores dignity in ways revenge never could. True legacy isn't measured by what we keep, but by what we give our kindness, our integrity, our lessons, and the strength we pass down. When we choose to act with grace instead of bitterness, we become living proof that justice and faith still walk hand in hand. A home, a memory, a name. All these things mean little without the love and character that built them. And even when life strips away what we thought defined us, it can lead us back to something deeper: peace, purpose, and the quiet joy of knowing we did right. If this story touched your heart, share your thoughts in the comments below. Subscribe to the channel for more stories that remind us what truly matters: family, faith, and the power of redemption.